they may not be my preferences anymore. So I want to have fairly stable, long-term things in there. In the middle is a bunch of things that you could potentially argue about. So diminishing sensitivity. Now, we know about diminishing marginal returns. Diminishing sensitivity is the prospect theory version of this. So a very neat way of describing this thing, particularly if I leave loss aversion out for now, is what it says is as outcomes get further and further away from where I am now, I become less and less sensitive to change. So I am very sensitive to gaining 100 pounds right now, but if you give me a choice between gaining 100,000 pounds and 1,000 pounds and 1,100, that extra 100 I'm less sensitive to, and the same on the downside. This diminishing sensitivity is something that we see in all aspects of psychology and indeed in animal behavior. People are, it's called Weber's law, people are, and animals are, display diminishing sensitivity to changes as it gets further and further away from their current state. We could think about this in the version of room temperatures again. If the temperature here went up by 5 degrees, I would probably notice it. If it went down by 5 degrees, I'd probably notice it. Would I be able to tell the difference between up 20 and up 25? No, it's all bloody hot. Would I be able to tell the difference between minus 20 and minus 25? No, it's all bloody cold. So we face this diminishing sensitivity away from where we are right now. So would I include this or not? I don't know. The reason I would say not is simply this. Diminishing sensitivity requires a reference point. The reference point immediately means framing, because if I shift the reference point mentally, it means that I enter a different frame and it changes the choices. So I cannot really have diminishing sensitivity, even though it seems like a reasonable thing to include, without inducing in framing effects. The same is true of loss aversion. Loss aversion, this kink at the reference point, is essentially a framing effect. It says, when I change my reference point, the position of that kink in my utility curve or my value function changes. The outcomes may not change at all. The absolute outcomes may not change at all, but the value I ascribe to them changes simply because I have shifted the reference point.
So would that depend upon like what you're using the utility function for? Like for example, if you're applying that, do you want to include some sort of sensitivity? Like, if I get 10%, it's 7 this year, they're going to 5.
Yes. I agree. That is a different problem, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Like, what are we thinking about the utility function?
Yeah, you're right. Okay. Yeah, which is actually spot on. Absolutely. If our job is to think about a utility function for the optimal thing, the optimal risk-return trade-off to have for the long term, I, as a rational investor who cares about that long term, should not care about the variability along the way. I, as a normal investor, do care about the variability way, and you, as an advisor, care about the fact that I care about it because you might get fired. So you're absolutely right, and this is one of the reasons why actually it is very difficult for financial advisors to genuinely do what is right for their clients, because doing what is right for your clients may induce, because of loss aversion and all these other aspects, may induce misery along the journey, and that misery comes with the chance that they will pull their money out. So, and we see this particularly in bubbles, right? So the internet bubble, the fact that the most sensible investors who were doing the best, most sensible thing for their clients did not jump on the bandwagon and jump into that bubble, they then proceeded to underperform all of their peers for the next 3 years, at which point people pulled their money out and threw it at fund managers who were investing in the bubble. So it's one of these things where you can think about as career risk as opposed to financial risk, is that often your clients' emotional reactions along the journey make it impossible for you to genuinely do what is optimal for their financial objectives, because their emotional objectives get in the way. And that's actually a theme that we will return to, but it's absolutely spot on. There is an assumption here that we are trying to do something very specific, which is to argue, how do I find the best trade-off between risk and return of a set of portfolios at some distant future point in time. And if that's what I'm trying to do, I need to leave these things out. And probability distortion, well, here it comes back to this. The minute I incorporate probability distortion in my model of preferences, I'm no longer using accurate probabilities. So I'm stacking the odds against myself. So where we come down to actually here is that almost everything that isn't expected utility theory in this example of what I'm trying to do is stuff that I should leave out, not ignore. So this is the vital thing. I don't ignore it. I'm going to return to it later and go, I know that you're loss averse. It is not rational for me to optimize your portfolio for your loss aversion, because your loss aversion is something you feel right now today. And 15 years down the road, if I come back and say, I just put you in cash for the last 15 years because you were loss averse, you're not going to thank me for it. However, I know you're loss averse, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do other things along the journey to try and help you to mitigate that emotional pain that you feel along the way. So we'll return to that. So let's choose a utility function. The way to go about this, I think, is to start narrowing it down and to basically say, for this particular problem, what are the characteristics I would want this utility function to have? And then I look through the space of possible mathematical functions for ones that meet those criteria. And hopefully what I end up with is I can settle on a unique functional form or a unique family of functional forms that will obey the criteria I want to have. So before we get there, though, a vital question is utility of what? Because we have in standard utility theory, I've got utility of wealth. In cumulative prospect theory, I've got the value function on changes in wealth. What do I want to plug into this function? So firstly, the function should reflect only stable financial preferences for risk and return. I want it to be long-term. I don't want it to be ephemeral. I want to exclude all psychophysical probability distortion, not because people don't experience it, but because it's illogical to optimize for it. I want the outcomes to reflect things that are actually what I'm trying to achieve. What I'm trying to achieve by investing is I am effectively trying to optimize my long-term outcome, and my outcome should be my real returns at a long-term time horizon that are post-fees, post-tax, post-whatever. So this potentially adds all sorts of complications, but let's for now leave fees off. Let's leave the tax stuff off. What I want to be able to plug into a utility function is long-term outcomes of wealth. And what I can do is it is possible for me to shift between a function. I can actually bring part of the prospect theory stuff in here, because any utility function on wealth, can be rewritten in the form of a different utility function. Let's call it, I don't know, what do we call it? I'm not going to use U prime. Let's say, let's use that utility function on changes in wealth. So I can rewrite it. If I want to refer to things relative to a reference point, the most natural thing for me to plug in is returns, because that's what everyone ultimately cares about. I can always swap between measuring returns, and as long as I have a starting wealth position, I can convert every return into a wealth level, and I can go backwards and forwards. But there are reasons for using returns. One is it means I can define a utility function that is independent of my starting wealth level. I don't have to plug in a starting wealth level. I can go, it's returns on whatever your starting wealth level is. And the other thing I want to do is I want it to be continuous returns, because I don't want my optimization function to be subject to changes in the periodicity with which I measure things. So if I move from optimizing monthly or daily or annually, etc., I want things to be continuous. So the logical thing for me to use is continuous log returns on total wealth. So this would be the wealth outcome at time t over the wealth outcome at time 0. So this is what I'm going to use as my inputs into that function. And if I wanted to convert my utility function back again, I could always solve this for the wealth level and back it out. This last one is important, total wealth. There is a big difference between someone's utility over their total wealth and their utility in small gambles. This comes back to the mental accounting story, or our tendency to view things myopically. If I was to calculate someone's utility function by looking at small gambles and inflate that up and apply it to their total wealth, I would get some quite scary things back again. In particular, what we find is that people in small gambles exhibit a level of risk aversion that, as we saw earlier, when I escalate that up to the level of the market, it implies absurd risk aversion. Or at the level of their total wealth would apply absurd risk aversion. The important thing here is that I have to choose something to be optimizing over. And I could choose to optimize over a sub-portfolio, or I could choose to optimize over total wealth, but I cannot use the same utility function to do both. I would have to re-parameterize that utility function if I'm solving for a different thing. The reason I would use total wealth is it's the most natural starting point. It is about that individual's wealth as a whole. If I'm optimizing for a sub-portion of that wealth, I then get into all sorts of questions about which portion, how do I choose that portion, how do I parameterize the utility on that portion relative to another portion, etc. So what we are going to do is we're going to be looking for a utility function that optimizes over log returns on total wealth, and ideally we would do it after tax, after fees, etc., etc. I'm not going to introduce those complications now. What criteria should I wish this utility function to have? So here's a few, and I think they are in sort of decreasing order of confidence. So firstly, I would want it to be continuous. I don't want there to be discrete jumps in my utility function. I want this utility function, as I go from 0 returns upwards, I don't want suddenly to go, oh, hang on, if I get 1p more at this point, I suddenly get massively more utility from it, because then I'm going to get some very strange results. Okay, so I want a continuous utility function. What that implies, the no discrete jumps, implies that there is always a trade-off to be had. It says there is no point at which, if I just gave this person 1p more, they would accept vastly more risk. It means there's always a continuous trade-off. I might, give them 1p more, they might accept that in exchange for a reduction in risk, but it would be an infinitesimal reduction in risk. I'm spending time on this simply because there are people who deny this. There are people who would say, actually, we do want to put discontinuous jumps in. And the reason for this, and we touched a little bit on goals-based investing last time. I can't remember who asked the question, but here you go. The one approach to goals-based investing says, tell me your goal. Tell me what you want from your life, from this pot of money. And let's imagine that people actually know what their goals are, and they know it with a degree of certainty that they can go, I know when I want it, and I know how much I need. So maybe my goal is, I don't know, to buy a Lamborghini. And let's imagine that to buy a Lamborghini, I need £1 million, and that is all that matters to me in life. I just want this Lamborghini. If I don't get it, I'm going to be miserable. And if I get £1 million in one or £1 million or £3 million, I don't care, because all that matters to me is getting this Lamborghini. What would matter then is if I drew the utility function, is it said, I actually don't care at all about getting increased returns until those returns buy me the Lamborghini, at which point I get huge amounts of utility from it, and after that I don't care at all. So you have a utility function that looks like that. Now, you could argue that that is a reasonable thing to want, and indeed maybe it wouldn't be quite that extreme. Maybe I would get increasing utility, and then there'd be a jump and I'd get increasing utility again. For various reasons, I don't think that is ever a wise thing to do, which is not to say I don't think goals-based investing is a wise thing to do. I don't think using this sort of utility function to do it is a wise thing to do, because what this implies is that I may have an investment that would enable me to get to 900,000 at very low risk, and I would go, I'm absolutely not going to do that. I'm not prepared to make the trade-off. Unless it's $1 million, I'm not prepared to do it at all. So whenever you have discontinuous jumps in your utility function, you start to observe very, very strange behaviors. Now, you can imagine a class of decisions where this is true. And indeed, we observe it in animal behavior. So there's a whole field of sort of decision biology, if you like, which is called optimal foraging theory. And if you have an animal that has a certain calorific requirement to get through the day, it's, I don't know, some small bird that burns energy really, really fast. And if it doesn't, guys, come please. If it doesn't get to this calorie level, it dies, right? Now, this bird, if you gave it an option between, said, oh, here's a safe bet that gets you, so let's say it needs 1,000 calories. There's a safe bet that it'll get you 900 calories for certain, or there's a gamble that will get you above 1,000 or down here. To that bird, it doesn't matter. Anything less than 1,000 and they die, right? There's similar behaviors that we observe in developed countries in subsistence farming circumstances, where people are choosing between a cash crop and a safe cash crop, a safe subsistence crop and a very variable cash crop. So do I plant maize, which I know is going to give me a clear return, or do I plant coffee beans, which if it pays off will give me a lot of money, and if it doesn't, I'll lose a lot. And there, again, if it's about survival, then discontinuous jumps in the utility function make sense. But in almost every other aspect of life where we're optimizing over money across many different goals, it is always possible to repurpose money from one goal to another and to trade things off. So these discontinuous jumps result in some very extreme behaviors when I start to optimize for them. I probably spent too long on this now. I was going to bring it in a few lectures' time. But anyway, let me move on. Except I'm right that we shouldn't have discontinuous jumps in utility function. What else should I want it to be? I should want it to be monotonic. I really want this to be increasing. As my wealth increases, utility should not go down. It might flatten out, but it should not go down. I should want it to exhibit concavity. There should be decreasing importance to achieving higher levels of return. In other words, I should want to impose some sort of risk aversion on people. People should not want to take risk without being paid something in return for it. Now, once I have imposed these three conditions, continuity, monotonicity, and concavity, I've restricted the class of utility functions by some amount, but there's still a whole bunch of things that are concave. Notice I've cut out quadratic utility here because it doesn't obey these things. I should also want to have decreasing absolute risk aversion. My 50-50 gamble for plus or minus 100 pounds should become less important to me as I become much, much wealthier. Okay? Now, at this point, you end up with a very much smaller set of potential forms of the utility function. And interestingly, these monotonicity, if I impose that, it's also imposing first-order stochastic dominance on the thing. So if I've got that, I will never choose a stochastically dominated alternative. Concavity imposes second-order stochastic dominance. So if I've got that, I will never choose a portfolio that's dominated according to second-order stochastic dominance. But I'm still left with too many utility functions. And that's where we get to the last one. So I'm going to impose on here constant relative risk aversion, so that my gamble between plus or minus 10% of my wealth, I remain equally willing to take that gamble as I get richer or as I get poorer. Now, this one is not obvious that we should impose it. And the reason it's not obvious is it's not immediately intuitive to me that as people get richer, they wouldn't be slightly less likely to roll the dice on winning or losing 10% of their wealth. We also have the situation where if I get less wealthy, you might have the intuition that equally I should get What do we have? We might have the intuition that I'd get less likely to take the gamble as I get wealthier. We might have the intuition that I would get more likely to take the gamble as I get wealthier. We simply don't know. People are different. Some might go one way, some might go the other way. Which indeed is one of the reasons why I think we're justified in imposing this. So one of the reasons is this. If I'm trying to optimize a portfolio for you, then what I should do is be humble. I should not be in the situation where I say, I am going to assume how your risk preferences are going to change in the future as your wealth level changes. So if I do that, if I assume increasing relative risk aversion or decreasing relative risk aversion, it means I'm imposing my assumption on how your risk level, your risk attitudes are going to change as your wealth level changes. So the least hubristic thing to do is to say, I'm going to just assume that it's constant, and what I'm going to do back is I'm going to come in and in a year's time, I'm going to check in with you again, and I'm going to see whether your risk level has changed. So it's a much less opinionated way of building this in. The other reason for doing it is empirical. If we look at the risk, at the price of risk that is implied by real interest rates over the last several hundred years, if people were systematically either increasing or decreasing in relative risk aversion, then we should see that this price of risk, the equity risk premium, etc., would have shifted as the world has got, as many countries in the world have got substantially richer over the last few hundred years. And yet, in the very, very long term, there doesn't seem to be any fundamental shift in the degree to which humans are prepared to be paid, or the payment humans require in order to take financial risk. So we have no empirical justification for saying it's one way or the other. We have no individual justification for imposing one way or the other. So it's not as strong a rationale as monotonicity or concavity, but if we impose constant relative risk aversion, what we end up with is a single utility function that is the only one that satisfies all of those things, which is an exponential utility function on, what have we got this here? An exponential utility function on log returns. Now, you may have come across the notion of a CRRA, a constant relative risk utility function, before. And very often in the literature where you see that, it is not an exponential function, it is a power function. The reason for that is the fact that we are imposing this function on log returns. So an exponential function on log returns is equivalent to a power function on wealth levels. So we can move backwards and forwards between the two. Okay? But here is an example of this exponential function. If I have extremely low risk tolerance, then I get miserable at a much faster rate as things go bad, and I get happier with positive events much faster. And we can then move to a medium one and a high risk tolerance function. So with a single parameter, these are single parameter functions, I have a function that meets all of these criteria that I can use to swap out the quadratic function from Markowitz and impose on it instead this exponential function on log returns to total wealth in a way that enables me to rebuild the portfolio theory on something that is more normatively justified than mean variance analysis. And that function looks like that, although there's some tops missing to the brackets, but ignore that. Has a single parameter t that governs the degree of risk aversion. So my expected utility of log returns on total wealth is equivalent to me taking the distribution of returns and plugging it into this function and taking the expectation over it. Okay? Now, that's a kind of starting point because there's a lot of work to do on that. But actually, if I was to simply do that, if I was to simply calculate for any possible distribution, the number, the expectation of it through that, I would end up for a given value of t, I would have to impose some parameter of t. I would end up being able to rank order every possible portfolio or every possible distribution, and I'd be able to pick the one that was the highest for people. And it makes no assumptions about me only caring about mean and variance. It actually, in this, I care about every aspect of the returns distribution in a very specific way. And we will get that now. So, we could stop there. In order to optimize a portfolio, I simply need a function that is going to provide a value for any distribution of outcomes, and I can rank them and I can pick the top one. The problem with that is it's not very intuitive. So if I did this, I would take a whole bunch of portfolios, I would look at their future returns distribution, I'd plug it into the function, it would come out with a number. That number would be largely meaningless. All that would matter was the rank order of all possible portfolios on that number. So what I'm missing is I'm missing Markowitz's graphical intuition of being able to put these things on a risk-return horizon, to be able to draw the efficient frontier, to be able to draw the indifference curve. And I'd like to get back some of that functionality, because that's what makes his methodology so powerful, is not just the fact that it's an optimization procedure, but it's an optimization procedure that has a lot of intuitive meaning in terms of the trade-offs that we see and how we can show them graphically, how we can help people to understand them. So, what I've got to is an expected utility function I can use. What I would like to do is to decompose that optimization into a trade-off between a measure of return, of expected return, and a measure of risk, in the same way that Markowitz had mean and variance. Now, on the one hand, I've got expected return, that's fixed. I've got a utility function, that's fixed. I've now got two moving parts. I've got a measure of risk, and I've got, how does this work? So I've got a measure of risk over here, and I've got a function that tells me how I trade those two things off. The indifference curve is the function that tells me the indifference between risk and return. So if I've got, this is fixed and this is fixed, and I've got two moving parts here, the minute I fix one of these, it's going to, I've run out of degrees of freedom. It's going to impose structure on the other one. So I could either go, let me choose a really simple way of trading off risk and return. I'm going to choose this function, and I'm going to calculate what it implies for the risk measure I have, or I'm going to do the other way around, and I'm going to say, I'm going to choose a risk measure, and then I'm going to let that naturally, mathematically impose the risk-return trade-off. And I'm going to go for this one for a couple of reasons. One is, risk means something. In the same way as we've gone through a utility function and said, what are the criterion I would want a utility function to exhibit? In the same way as a risk measure, I should go, what are the things a risk measure should do for it to be intelligible to me? So I can go here and say, let me fix a deviation risk measure. Now, I need to digress just a little bit here, because there are a whole lot of different risk measures we could use, right? There's standard deviation, there is expected loss, there is value at risk, there is conditional value at risk. I mean, there's a billion ways of reflecting the risk of a distribution. And we want to do something quite specific here. The most general partitioning of risk measures into two groups is that between a deviation measure and a generalized risk measure. And the distinction is really quite simple. If I took a distribution of returns like this, and I shifted the whole distribution up, I maintained the shape exactly, but I shifted the mean up, what happens to the risk measure? Like that. So a deviation risk measure is a risk measure that only reflects deviations from the mean. So if I shift this whole distribution up, the risk does not change, only the expected return, only the mean changes. So we can think very quickly of examples of risk measures like that. Standard deviation is a deviation risk measure. It is independent of the mean. If I change the mean of the distribution but keep the shape the same, the standard deviation does not change. So variance, lower partial moments, there's a whole bunch of them. What this innate deviation measures enable me to completely separate risk and return so that they are orthogonal factors, which means that I can draw them in two-dimensional space, knowing that when I move a portfolio or I move an asset in one dimension, it does not influence the position on the other dimension. Generalized risk measures are the opposite. When I move this up, it changes the risk measure. And so here we have things like value at risk, C-value at risk, coherent risk measures. These are ones where if I push the whole distribution up, the mean of the distribution shifts,